Beep. Yep. Okay, so we're going to cover the central nervous system today, chapter 12, page 430 to 440, and 460 to 464. So we're more concerned about the anatomy of it. Having said that, though, we will run a bit into the physiology of the central nervous system. Of course, we have to get the important stuff out of the way. Make sure, make sure you get your deposit in for your Euro trip, tour, whatever you want to call it. Because it is coming up. Look at that beautiful scenery in Switzerland, in Paris, France. Wow. So nice. Just saying, as a week from my hotel room. The top one is not the bottom one. The bottom one, that would have been half. Quiz number 9 will be posted this Friday at 4 p.m. and it's available until December 18th. We're like 3 weeks ago. Not even. Kind of scared. And you do need 80% to access the next week's notes. Multiple attempts are permitted, of course. A little bit of change. Originally, we were going to do joints and ligaments this week, but we covered it before the midterm. So when I was reviewing the textbook, I thought, let's go instead into the central nervous system and give you some information about how, not necessarily how it works, but what's involved, what's the anatomy of the central nervous system. So that will be this week, and then next week we have the skin and fascia, and then exam review, and then the week after that, it's finals. I know. I have night terrors or Georgian night terrors. Okay, so the central nervous system obviously is the brain and the spinal cord. Those are two major components. Anything outside the brain and spinal cord is called the peripheral nervous center or system. And I mean, the central and peripheral nervous system, we're not too worried about, but if you go higher education, you may be worried about things such as dermatomes and which spinal nerve feeds into which area of the body or which muscle is innervated by which spinal nerve. So there is significance in terms of testing for neurological damage or injury or reflexes or just in terms of understanding which nerve spinal nerve feeds which structure. There's a process of cephalization. So cephalization is the development of the anterior portion, the front portion of the central nervous system. And basically you get an increased number of neurons within the brain, and humans have some of the highest number of neurons within the brain, hence why we're doing all those wonderful things. Of course, sometimes we look at things such as Justin Bieber and we think maybe we don't have that many brain cells. We move on. So in terms of development, when you're an embryo, your brain and spinal cord start as a neural tube, which can be seen in this picture right here. And then we start to see the primary brain vesicles form. So we get 3 brain vesicles, forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. So procephalon, the mesencephalon, and the rhombocephalon. The hindbrain being the back, mesencephalon being the middle, procephalon, procephalon being the front. Or the forebrain, and then they start to differentiate into the different areas in terms of what they are responsible for or what they become. So the hindbrain, really, the mesencephalon, the very tail of it becomes a spinal cord when you're an adult. And that is the next point anyways. And the thing about brain development is brain development grows a lot faster than the skull. So what you're seeing at the top, week 5, so this is week 5 post-conception. After that night, maybe the day, you can see there's really not a whole lot there, but you can already start to differentiate different parts of the brain. Now, of course, it's not color-coded like this. Like it's an artist's interpretation, and they've added in coloring so that you can see the different sections, and you can see where those sections grow to become. But basically, the brain folds into itself in order to occupy the skull, right? Because it's growing much, much faster than the skull. The cerebral hemisphere doubles back, so it kind of dives forward and doubles back. You can see week 13 kind of here, with the arrows. And then by birth, you have basically what is the adult structure of the brain. Question is, how long does the brain develop? Which was just asked by one of your peers before the class started. The brain continually develops typically until 23, 24. So there is a good amount of research to show that substances or behaviors, the earlier you expose a child to the substances or behaviors, the more likely it's going to affect neurological development. recreational or illicit substances, or even legal substances, or even behaviors such as screen time in terms of your tablets or your television or whatever the case may be. And marketers take advantage of this. There's loads of research that shows that marketers take advantage. Any 2-year-old out there, you could go up to any 2-year-old in a mall, maybe ask their parents first, and show them the McDonald's thing, and say, what restaurant is this? And they'll go McDonald's, right? So the earlier you expose the brain to something, the more of an influence it'll have. Of course, having said that, does development ever really end? Yeah, but kind of no. The brain, they thought at one point, was just plastic, like it stops developing. But we know that you must be able to influence the brain, because here you all are in your late teens, early 20s, and you're learning anatomy. And you might get to the age of 50 and say, I'm going to learn a new language, and learn a new language or a new skill. The regions. So the 4 main regions are the cerebral hemisphere. So the cerebral hemisphere is what we think of when we're looking at the brain. So right now we're looking at the side of the brain. This is the back, this is the front, top, bottom, obviously. So the cerebral hemisphere is the main bulk of the brain. The diencephalon is at the very, very center. And then you have the brain stem, which is kind of considered the primitive portion of the brain, where you have your midbrain, pons, medulla. But all those things are responsible for more automatic functions, such as breathing, heart rate, perspiration, vomiting, those kind of things. And then the cerebellum also is considered kind of like the primitive cerebellum or cerebral. So those are your main components of your brain. In terms of the regions and the organization, has anybody kind of heard the term gray matter, like use your gray matter or work on my gray matter? Or, I'm not talking about different shades of gray, that's like a completely different topic. Maybe that's for your gen ed course you can talk about there. But gray matter is basically, these are the short, non-myelinated neurons in the cell body. So this is basically where we believe the majority of higher level processes occur within your gray matter. The white matter are basically the axons. So did you cover neurophysiology and physiology, yeah? Did you look at what a cartoon neuron looks like? Yeah, like from a textbook. So everybody, it's very simple to draw. You draw like a little starburst pattern, except one of the tails is long. You know, it's Christmas, so everybody can draw stars. Even if you're not celebrating Christmas, you still draw a star. And this long tail is called the axon. So the white matter is made up of the cell bodies, where you have all the connections. And then the gray matter is made up of the axons. And when we say myelinated, myelinated basically means that you have these myelin sheaths. Right, that are from Schwann cells, and these myelin sheaths from Schwann cells actually come from a Schwann cell, and then there'll also be a myelin sheath on another neuron. So this actually helps to speed up transmission of the neural signal. And just to give you a kind of cool idea of what the actual size of this is, a proportion, if the cell body was the size of a tennis ball, so let's say it's about the size of my fist, right? And this was in a normal size living room. So let's say it's a 15-foot by 15-foot living room. So we'll say it's maybe from the smart screen to me, to that podium, and maybe to Matt Stuckles and Tom, right? So it's in a room that big. If that was your neuron body, all the dendrites that receive signals would be about the thickness of spaghetti and would fill up the entire room. And the axon, whatever direction it goes, would go probably in that direction, or maybe, let's say in that direction, for about 2 kilometers. That's the proportion of size of your neurons. Basic pattern, central cavity surrounded by the gray matter. So the white matter is on the outside, the gray matter is on the inside. And you can kind of see this, so you can kind of see this right here in terms of a cross-section of the brain. Okay, moving on. You also have these ventricles. So where else have you heard ventricles? Where else do you have ventricles that we've introduced? Right? Yeah, the heart, right? Getting back to the heart of the matter. You also have ventricles, which are spaces within your brain. So when someone says, like, you got a hole in your head, actually you kind of do. You got a fluid-filled chamber within your brain. And these ventricles are filled with fluid. It's called cerebral spinal fluid, CSF. So you may have heard, if you ever had a friend go to the hospital or had to get like a cerebral spinal fluid sample, they go into the spinal cord and draw out some of the fluid. It's true. This is what is also called an epidural. So if you've ever, ladies, if you're like, you know, you've conceived, you're developing a little baby, and you're like, I'm gonna have a baby, all natural. Good for you, because I'm not a guy, I have no idea what it feels like, and I don't want to know either. But no one's going to blame you if 24 hours into contractions, you say, pat me doc, I'm out, right? And what they'll do is they will go directly into the cavity where the spinal cord is, and inject an anesthetic, and basically numb everything from there down. My wife almost left me for the anesthesiologist with the birth of our first son. I couldn't blame her. It was like, you can see the relief, it's like, right? So, makes that childbirthing thing actually kind of fun for her. So you get a cerebral spinal fluid, it goes up all the way around the brain and in through the ventricles, and there is a pattern to the flow, but you don't have to worry about that. But you have these lateral ventricles, they're C-shaped chambers. You can see them on this diagram right here from page 432, and they're deep, deep within the brain, and they're separated by a septum pellucidum, which is a fancy name for just this structure that separates the two of them. And the cerebral spinal fluid flows throughout the whole and bathes basically the whole brain. Each lateral ventricle is connected to a third ventricle via foramen meaning hole, right? So it means the same thing in the bones, right? Foramen magnum at the bottom of your skull, obturator foramen in your os coccyx or your hips. Now you have the intraventricular foramen, makes sense. Foramen between the ventricles, intraventricular. And then that third ventricle is connected to a fourth ventricle down here at the base of the skull via this little lateral cerebral aqueduct. And then that's within the very base of your brain, and that's continuous with the central canal and the spinal cord. So it goes all the way down the spinal cord, all the way back up. Because your blood doesn't actually come in contact with your brain except in a couple of rare areas. There are some exceptions. The top is showing a real brain from this section, and the reason why there's blue on that is they've injected the blood vessels with a blue dye so that they stand out more. Not to worry about that. But you have the cerebral hemispheres, and this is what we think of when we think of brain, right? We think of brain, we think of cerebral hemispheres, and this accounts for the majority, right? Over 4/5 of the mass of the brain, right? So it's a lot of real estate it's taking up. And there are these surface markings. So you may wonder, why do we have all these folds within the brain? Why isn't it just smooth? And why is that? Why do we have all these folds within the brain?
Surface area.
Surface area.
Yeah.
What does it do with surface area?
Increases it.
Yeah, increases surface area, right? Surface area, more smarts, or at least more functioning matter, more potential for smarts. So you have gyri, which are ridges, sulci, which are grooves, and then fissures, which are really, really deep grooves. There's a longitudinal fissure, goes all the way from anterior to posterior, right down the middle. And then you have a transverse cerebral fissure, separates the cerebrum and the cerebellum, right? Cerebellum being that tiny little part of the back. And you have your transverse, right? It makes sense, transverse plane, right? Uh-oh, that came back to bite you in the butt, right? And then your sulci are divided into 5 hemispheres, and generally they correspond to the bones. They're over top. So you got the frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. The only one you don't have is the insula, but the insula is deep, deep, deep. So if you remember the cranial bones, you'll remember what the lobes are of the brain. And then it says force 4, the insula is very deep, so if we were to like drill into the, go like, right, and pull away the skull patch and poke a couple of areas, and the page's like, I smell burnt toast, right? And we were to pull back, aside from vertigo and seizures, we'd be able to see into the insula, but we won't do that because we're like page. So, and it's very deep, deep, deep. You know that they have, I don't know if anybody's heard of this, but they found ancient graves where there were like ancient skull operations, like ancient civilizations would actually cut out a patch of the skull and the pressure would be relieved, and they knew that these people survived the operations because there was healing. So there you go. Just saying though, don't go home and get Dad's Black and Decker and be like your sister or brother, like, I take no responsibility if that happens again. The major sulci, so there's a central sulcus right here that separates the frontal from the parietal lobe. And then parietal occipital sulcus is right here at the back, separates the parietal from the occipital lobe. And then the lateral sulcus separates the temporal from the parietal and the frontal lobe. Okay? And each hemisphere basically has the cerebral cortex of gray matter on the outside, the white matter internally, and the basal nuclei deep within the white matter, right? And this is gray matter on the outside where all the higher level functioning items are happening, I would think. Like right now you're thinking, Wicked Wednesday tomorrow. Should I go or no? Don't. Anything with Wicked, I say don't go. Cerebral cortex. So it's kind of ironic that the part of your body that gets to decide what's the smartest part of your body decides on itself. I think it's kind of biased. The heart doesn't get sick in that. Personally, I think there's a couple of sphincters down below that are very important because if they ever tighten up or let loose, then you're done.